This summer I've been reading these essays by theologian and minister Debbie Thomas, and I've just loved reading her writings. And so this morning I want to share some inspiration from one of those essays with you. Now, here's the deal about myself. I know myself. And if I could force things to grow in my life, to thrive, to produce, some foolproof combination of hard work and sheer willpower, the reality is I would. I have liked being able to control things. I have liked results. I like knowing that if I do A, B will happen. But life doesn't work that way, does it? I mean, can you relate to this? And this can be an ideal that I've tried to impose on a number of areas of my life: work, marriage, parenting, friendship. This ideal of controlling a linear progression for growth. This idea of defined labor and tangible reward. And of course, whenever I do this, what do I get? I get anxiety. Have I covered all the bases? What will happen if I fail? And on and on and on. At times, I've even tried to do this in my spiritual life, and it especially doesn't work there. But I've come to be very thankful that trying that process in my spiritual life is not the kind of spiritual life that Jesus talks about, especially in one of his parables. Let me read this one from Mark. Again, Jesus said, God's kingdom is like what happens when a farmer scatters seed in a field. The farmer sleeps at night and is up and around during the day. All by themselves, the seeds keep sprouting and growing, and he doesn't understand how. It is the ground that makes the seeds sprout and grow into plants that produce the grain. Then when the harvest season comes and the grain is ripe, the farmer cuts it with a sickle. Finally, Jesus says, what is God's kingdom like? What story can I use to explain it? It is like what happens when a mustard seed is sown into the ground. It is the smallest seed in the world, but once it is sown, it grows larger than any garden plant. It even puts out branches that are big enough for birds to nest in the shade. Jesus used many other stories when he spoke to the people, and he taught them as much as they could understand. He did not tell them anything without using stories. But when he was alone with the disciples, he explained everything to them. So, at least from my perspective, let me explain some things, and using some of Debbie Thomas's thoughts about this parable. In the first parable of the stories, he offers his listener this gardener who scatters seed on the ground, and then he goes off to sleep. The seeds, once they're scattered, now have to fend for themselves, or as the writer of Mark says, all by themselves. They have to produce. And then when the grain is ripe, the gardener harvests it, right? That's in the first part of the parable. In the second parable, someone sows a tiny mustard seed in the ground, and it grows into a gigantic bush, large enough to offer birds shelter in the branches. Okay, so that's the backstory. That's the parable. Both of these parables, insofar as Jesus is intending these two stories to capture what Christian spirituality is about. And if you were a hearer of those stories, it sounds utterly ridiculous, almost a big cosmic joke. They are intended to stretch our imaginations and take us beyond any place we would just go on our own. So let's start with the sleeping gardener. If you are any type of workaholic, perfectionist, entrepreneur, you can easily see what's wrong with this first parable, right? Because good gardeners don't toss a bunch of seed and then they go take a sneeze during the growing season. They plan, they plod, they hover, they manicure little roads, they keep a wary eye on the weather, they protect the garden from birds and rabbits and deer. And from early springtime to harvest time, they water, they fertilize, they prune, they weed, they worry. That's what they do. But the gardener in Jesus' parable, he goes to sleep. He doesn't slog. He doesn't micromanage. He doesn't second guess. Instead, he just enjoys the slumber that comes from leaning into a process that is perennial, that is ancient, that is mysterious, that is cyclical, that is sure. He trusts the process. He trusts the seed. He trusts the soil, the sun, the shade, the clouds, the rain. He trusts it all. And yeah, he participates in the process by planting and harvesting. He pays attention to the season and gets to work when the time is right. But this gardener never harbors the illusion that he's in charge, that he's operating in the realm of the mystery of it all. In this story that Jesus tells, it's not about piety or impressive prayers or anything what we think of spiritual that grows us in God's garden. It is the dance between the process of trusting God and the process by us. Last year I did a therapeutic intensive in Southern California where I went away for a week to just focus on some deep things in my life and that are part of my lifelong story. And when I got there with the 7 other people that I would be participating in this group therapy with, I was just radically afraid, really. I was just afraid of this whole thing. What would this whole intensive mean? And I remember the therapists and all the directors at this place I was at, they just kept saying, trust the process. Just trust the process. I know you're uncertain. I know you're a bit anxious and fearful. I know you're wondering where this all will go. But just trust the process. And I did. I chose to. And it made all the difference. It was the right thing to do. Now, what about the soil in this story Jesus tells? According to this, in this parable, God's kingdom is both fertile, which means it's capable of generating life, but it's also hidden. It's both generous, but it is mysterious. The fertile magic of the soil is all underground. It's deep beneath the surfaces of what we can see and quantify. And yet the soil mysteriously brings forth the abundance. All the nitty-gritty details we long to dissect, we want to master, they're all hidden from our eyes. And they all happen between planting and harvest time. And there's just these vast expanses where you have to hope, where you have to long, where you have to love, where you are uncertain. And I love, it's what writer-poet Annie Dillard says. She goes, our life is a faint tracing on the surface of mystery. There are some areas in my life where I can struggle with the soil, where I plant my hopes, my efforts, my prayers, my efforts. Here goes. I have to trust them into God's care or the universe's care. Psychologists and therapists have a word for this struggle. It's called vigilance. But sometimes our own experiences give us wisdom and caution. But the gardener in Jesus' story just trusts the process. Now, what about the second story that Jesus tells? In this story, a farmer sows mustard seed into the ground. The joke here is not only that mustard seeds are tiny, but as scholars have noted, that the people in Jesus' day probably didn't plant mustard seeds. Mustard is a weed. It's a noxious weed that just kind of invades anything. And a gardener in Palestine would be foolish to plant it because it will take over everything. It will break down the barriers of separation, separating the good stuff from the not so good stuff. I mean, what planter today would say, I'm going to plant a bunch of dandelions and broomweeds? They wouldn't, because these are commonplace nuisances that we try to get rid of, right? They stand in the way of our purpose. And mustard, moreover, is not a plant that grows with any stateliness or beauty. It's not like a cedar or a great sequoia or a well-tended rose bush or beautiful herb garden. It grows like a weed and it looks like one. So what do I think this story could be saying to me with this insignificant mustard seed? What does it mean for me, this invasive spindly weed, a plant we would rather discard, that this seed then becomes the very heart, the structural center that Jesus is emphasizing of what God's kingdom is like? It just goes, so what is beautiful then? What does matter? What is sacred? In a sense, this story that Jesus tells, it captures the whole narrative of Christian spirituality itself. I mean, wasn't Jesus, in a sense, figuratively, a tiny mustard seed? This backwater baby born in poverty on the edges of the empire that then gets a bunch of friends, raggedy fishermen, corrupt tax collectors who are clueless, clumsy, timid, doubtful, and then has all of our Christian tradition rests on these tiny mustard seeds. Maybe when I'm struggling to sleep and rest, so to speak, in God's care, maybe it's because I discount these tiny seeds, these small unfurlings, these places where the earth shifts and I think weeds are growing. Yeah, maybe I'm missing it. Then there's the last image Jesus gives in these set of parables. It's the image of nesting birds finding the branches in the shade of this mustard plant. You might think, oh, well, that's a pretty image. But to those hearers, and especially a farmer, it's kind of more like a joke. Birds eat the seeds. Birds eat the fruit. Birds wreak havoc in the cornfields. Birds are why farmers put up scarecrows. But Jesus isn't the type of gardener who puts up scarecrows. Why? Because in Christian spirituality, it's about welcoming the unwelcomed. It's about sheltering the unwanted. It's about practicing radical inclusion. In God's garden, in this parable, it doesn't exist for itself to be beautiful, to even be a place where you walk and have great beauty. It exists not for productivity or proclamation. It exists to be welcoming and hospitable. How many times has our tradition in its history, how many times has it shooed away the birds by policing the garden, right? You know, by ignoring those who society or our culture just ignores. No, the parable is about welcoming. And so what is God's kingdom like in this story? It seems God's kingdom is like, it's slow, it's mysterious growth, it's periods of fallowness, it's plants we can neither control or contain, it's weeds that run wild yet still nourish hungry, raucous beasts. It's a place where gardeners take naps. All of this, for me anyway, especially the type of person I am, that's good news. And the truth is, it can hurt to surrender our imaginations about God, about spirituality. It can hurt to loosen our grip. It can hurt to trust the process, trust the mystery of God. It can hurt to let go our version of God and spirituality. But whatever our temperaments or our circumstances, the challenge remains still to scatter the seed, to trust the process and allow it to rest in fertile soil. And the idea is, can we lean into this bizarre and almost laughable idea of what Christian spirituality and God's kingdom is like? But that's what I get from this story. And maybe we can learn something from it. You know, as we are celebrating Pride, I want to tell you about this amazing historic event that is probably seen as the catalyst for the modern LGBTQ rights movement. It's when they really fought for their rights. And this historic event is the Stonewall riots that happened in New York City during the summer of 1969. And what happened was, for several days, demonstrators clashed with law enforcement, demanding an end to the systemic persecution and discrimination that LGBTQ individuals faced. And so these spontaneous rebellions, they are so significant today because they became the pivotal moment for the fight of LGBTQ rights. So in the next moment or so, let me tell you about the Stonewall riots. In the early morning hours of June 28, 1969, a riot broke out in front of the Stonewall Inn in New York City. The Stonewall riots were a watershed moment in the gay rights movement, sparking activism and awareness across the entire United States. And the roots of these riots, the events, well, they were significant and they've had lasting impact, even being felt today. Now, in the 1950s and 1960s, being LGBTQ was still considered unlawful and illegal in 49 states. The punishments varied greatly by state, ranging from heavy fines to even imprisonment. In society, members of the gay community, well, they were often subject to violence and harassment and discrimination. So in New York City, gay bars became the havens for people with diverse sexual orientations and gender identities, places where they could avoid harassment and violence. And the Stonewall Inn served as a popular refuge. Now, the Stonewall Inn was actually owned by the Mafia, and the Mafia bribed the police to look the other way, and in turn, the Mafia made all their money by overcharging the patrons for drinks. But even so, the patrons were not fully safe from homophobia and discrimination. The Mafia would extort the wealthy patrons. They would threaten them to out them to their employers and families. And despite the Mafia's bribes, the police still regularly raided the Stonewall Inn and other gay bars around New York City, charging them with solicitation of homosexual relations. Trans and other gender nonconforming people, well, they were also targeted, subject to violence and arrest if they weren't wearing what the police deemed as gender-appropriate clothing. The oppression and the mistreatment, it all came to a head early in the morning hours of June 28, 1969, when 9 police entered the Stonewall Inn on a raid. The patrons were fed up, and as the police roughly tried to arrest the bartenders and the customers, many resisted. Outside the bar, people began by the hundreds. They began to riot. They threw bottles at the police. They pushed through the barricades. The police officers retreated from the crowd, and they locked themselves inside the Stonewall Inn. Rioters responded by setting the bar on fire. Police reinforcement arrived, and the original officers managed to get out of the burning bar. Meanwhile, the angry mob had grown from hundreds to now thousands, and eventually the police were able to get the crowd to disperse. But it didn't last long. The riots continued all the way to July 1st. While some have criticized the riots as violent and destructive, others pointed to the brutality and unjust treatment of the gay community by the police. This large-scale defiance made a massive impact on society. The Stonewall riots were the beginning of the modern gay liberation movement, which also brought attention to other marginalized for their sexual and gender orientation. The riots sparked the formation of the Gay Liberation Front, which was the first group to publicly advocate for equal gay rights. On the one-year anniversary of the riots, they also organized the first Gay Pride Parade. Today, as you know, Pride Parades are all over the country, all over the world, and many are held on the actual anniversary of the Stonewall riots. In 2016, President Obama made the Stonewall Inn and the area outside where the riots broke out a national monument. This became the first national monument celebrating gay history. The Stonewall riots were more rightful rebellion than quiet protests. They were good trouble because they marked the pivotal moment in history where people would no longer quietly endure the stigma associated with their sexual and gender orientations. And through the Stonewall riots, the gay rights movement gained mainstream visibility, and because of it, the modern LGBTQ rights movement is felt today, and it's still growing. This rightful rebellion galvanized a national movement, and the riots are widely seen as symbolizing the power of collective action, demanding equality and justice. And their legacy continues to inspire activism, the legislative process towards achieving full civil rights for the LGBTQ individuals. And now we're starting to see that inclusion happen in religious settings and in the church.